Hello watch enthusiasts and welcome to today's episode of the Watch Chronicler podcast. In today's episode it's all things Swiss made, with one major question to consider, which is should Swiss made still exist? We all know what Swiss made means in terms of the small signature at the bottom of the dial, and the pride which is associated with this when you look at a Swiss made watch, and the history behind Swiss made watches. But is this still relevant today? And so in today's podcast, I'm going to consider what Swiss made still means today, what it can mean, and how this is affected by the worldwide watchmaking landscape, in addition to what the future should hold for the Swiss made designation. Should we even still have Swiss made on the dials of watches, or should it no longer matter? So there's all that to look forward to in today's episode. Remember that you can catch this piece either as a video on YouTube or as a podcast on every major platform, including iTunes, SoundCloud and Spotify, and many more. If you enjoy these podcasts, head over to our website, watchchronicler.com, to be able to read full articles, catch our video reviews, and also to be able to find a full list of all of these podcasts for you to be able to catch up. This week's episode is sponsored by Oroj, the maker of unique watches for those who relish detail and innovation at a sensible price, but more about that later. To really understand the question of whether Swiss made as a sort of title for a set of watches and as a byword for quality, you have to look back at the reasons why we see Swiss made on the dials of watches. Now, Swiss made is, of course, the demonstration of a successful industry in a country. But the Swiss industry, in terms of watches, isn't as old as I think a lot of people realise, because during the preceding centuries, before the 20th century, or at least the very end of the 19th century, Swiss watches weren't, by any stretch of the imagination, the primary area where you would buy a watch from. There was still a lot of watchmaking in Germany, in France, in England, and so this wasn't really a centre of watchmaking. In fact, during the earlier parts of the 19th century, they produced what are described today as knockoff watches, knockoffs of pieces produced in France and in England. And if you look at the brilliant minds working in England and in France particularly, during the preceding two centuries, let's say the 17th and 18th centuries and into the 19th century, there was unbelievable innovation taking place, and Switzerland simply wasn't part of this. But just as Japanese watches developed unbelievable hold on the market in the 70s, you have to recognise that the Swiss industry had a similar sort of position to usurp the existing leaders in watchmaking. And it didn't happen quite so quickly. It happened between the beginning of the 20th century, I'd say, and the 1940s, when it's fair to say that Switzerland consolidated its position as a preeminent watchmaker. And there are various reasons, from the decline of the American watch industry, the fact that other European countries had the wars on their minds when Switzerland could continue focusing on these crafts, and even the geography of Switzerland with its valleys, where during a lot of the year people were stuck in a position where they couldn't farm and they would make money by producing clockwork. And so as a result, it's unsurprising that watchmaking became so prevalent as an industry in Switzerland and in these areas. But the truth is that Swiss made should have a lot of weight for a lot of buyers who've enjoyed Swiss watches for the last few decades, or are simply getting into watchmaking because there's an enormous amount of history there. Now, I am Swiss by nationality, half Swiss, half British, and I love this history, this art of Swiss watchmaking, and at the highest levels there is a unique approach to decoration and also to engineering within these movements. It's different to Japanese watchmaking, it's different to German watchmaking, but it's still remarkable nonetheless. And perhaps in the past, Swiss made more sense for products which had that particular title, because in Switzerland it was true to say that for the most part their movements and their production of watches was on a higher level to what was seen from other nations. Now, I recognise that Japan in particular did show some incredible innovation in the late 50s through the 60s and into the 70s, but it was a very different sort of watchmaking and didn't really cross over into the luxurious market of Swiss watchmaking. And so Swiss watches had this unique position in terms of producing some really remarkable pieces and also having captured the wristwatch market. And so brands like Rolex, Omega, Longines, Breitling and many others were able to fit into their particular market categories and do unbelievably well there. However, since those days in the mid-20th century, An awful lot has changed, and at the core of most discussions about Swiss made is the fact, which is very true and continues to be the case, that only 60% of the value of a Swiss watch has to be made in Switzerland. And that really brings up 2 points. Firstly, the fact that it's only 60%. A few years ago it was actually 50% and they bumped it up to 60%, but it does seem like it was a choice which was done to appease a lot of discussion about the subject, when even after this change a lot of brands are saying they don't want to put Swiss made on the dial because their watches go far beyond 60% and they find it to be, you could say, an insult to the investment they've put into Swiss manufacturing, that their Swiss made doesn't mean anything different to anyone else's. There is also the aspect of value, because labour in Switzerland is far, far more expensive than in the Far East, of course, and you do have the aspect that in some situations it's been pointed at some brands, and I don't have any proof to confirm or disprove this in this particular podcast, nor do I want to go into the specifics. But the point is that in some cases brands have been accused of QCing their watches, of quality controlling their watches in Switzerland, with significantly higher costs for labour time taken to inspect these watches, and are having parts manufactured elsewhere because it's not done by proportion of the watch but by the amount of value of that watch. So this is something which brings up a lot of discussion, and rightly so, because Swiss made is something which I think needs to be defended if it's going to contain any sort of value for the buyer. And so at the moment, most affordable Swiss watches, and by this I mean watches ranging from a few hundred to even into the few thousands, because this really does apply to watches costing up to £3,000 or £4,000, of course depending upon the brand and how they operate. But most of these Swiss watches and movements use considerable numbers of very good quality components, I hasten to add, produced in China and the Far East. And this is just because of a change in the manufacturing landscape around the world. The fact is that China has actually become an extremely good watchmaker in a lot of ways. The quality coming out of China is getting better and better and better, which is quite remarkable really, and demonstrates the amount of care taken there to further what Chinese manufacturers of watches can do, and also to give them a future, because at the moment something which a lot of people don't consider, and which I'm hearing more and more from brands, is that components coming from China are becoming more expensive. The fact is that the area around Hong Kong and certain areas of China have produced an awful lot of watch cases, an awful lot of watch dials, handsets, and movement components too. And the reasons for these are that in Germany, for example, some of the case manufacturers have gone under, in fact a very large proportion, and so sourcing things from the Far East tends to yield better quality at a lower price, and as you can imagine, producing a watch, these sorts of differences in price affect the overall quality of the product. You can offer a better quality product for less. And it's difficult to argue with that over the concept of having something only made in Switzerland as opposed to being made around the world, because ultimately the end consumer is going to be interacting with the product in a physical way every day. The identity of the watch is something which remains conceptual. It's not relevant to everyday use. And of course this is something which has been demonstrated time and time again by Microbrands operating with this approach of sourcing parts from all around the world to produce an affordable, high-quality watch. And I think this has been integral to the value offered by Microbrands, which may only produce a few hundred watches a year, but enough watches to sustain themselves and to be able to get a consistent supply of parts to produce these watches. And so you could say that it's only when you demand truly stunning craftsmanship that Swiss or Japanese nowadays watchmaking makes sense, because these are craftsmen who have received often greater training in terms of learning some of the finer points like movement finishing, case decoration from the perspective of fantastic quality polishing. And so it's these fine jobs where you see countries like Switzerland excel. But for the average mass-produced Swiss watch, I say, the value isn't necessarily there if you produce the product entirely in Switzerland. But now for a message from this podcast's sponsor. The sponsor of this podcast is Oroj, a brand with a unique outlook on design and quality, and with a remarkable new movement. Their 39mm Autark offers a sculpted titanium case which angles and curves inwards to gracefully cover the wrist. Its dial, available with a power reserve, large date and small seconds, all native to the in-house movement, is beautifully finished. To contrast the remarkable hands and markers is a case available in hardened titanium to shrug off the most testing abuse. By contrast, the Omnium, with its facet-cut crystal and diamond-cut hands, is presenting gleaming 904L stainless steel for added lustre. This piece represents a modern interpretation of the principles of quality, widespread production, and of everyday practicality professed by the visionary Bauhaus school of design. All housing a highly developed in-house movement with a silicon escapement, Oroj watches represent something truly new. Find out more at oroj.com. Now that we've addressed the matter of what Swiss-made means in this day and age, and how brands are addressing it, I think it's worth considering what the future could hold for Swiss-made, and what relevance it has to the watch industry in general. I think it's safe to say that Swiss-made does make sense for a product, like for example a Patek Philippe or an Audemars Piguet, a product in that sort of high level of watchmaking where, frankly, they are operating in a position where there's so much Swiss craftsmanship and so much Swiss tradition going into these pieces that it makes sense for them to proudly bear that word which is so evocative in the watch industry, which is Swiss. However, if you look at other price ranges, there is always some debate as to what should be said about Swiss-made. Now, some brands which are technically competing with the sort of market which might buy a Patek Philippe, like H. Moser and C, which is a brand producing highly luxurious pieces, they've taken a dim view to the Swiss-made designation and removed it from their dials altogether in favour of simply having a blank area there. And whether this is because they genuinely feel that in their price range Swiss-made no longer means anything, or whether they're trying to make a point in the media and draw more attention to themselves, I think it's difficult to tell. I would incline towards the latter. But they do have a point about the form, but I think it applies to more affordable watches in general. One use of Swiss-made which I think makes an awful lot of sense is what Alkin and Weiss are doing. Now, I'm a great supporter of Alkin and Weiss. They make some fantastic technical watches, and they have for many years now. This is a historic brand. They were the first brand to produce a 1,000-metre dive watch, for example, and I enjoy one of their watches. But their watches are not cheap for the average buyer. They're £1,000 plus, depending upon which model you go for, but they are 90% Swiss. And that says a lot. I believe the parts which come from elsewhere are pieces like, for example, the dial, where manufacturing actually makes sense elsewhere in terms of quality. And having a look at their dials, they are stunning. But I think that this is a brand which has committed itself to this Swiss nature, and as a Swiss brand, they are appealing to a market looking for this product. So as a result, I think it makes sense for them to cost what they cost, bearing in mind that they could probably add more features if they were made in a different way, but the quality is excellent and they're not being daft with their pricing. Their pricing is sensible for what they're offering, and they're bearing the Swiss-made concept very proudly, and I think that's important because they've incorporated it into the general image of their brand. And I think in that form, Swiss-made can continue to exist in affordable price ranges, but some changes will have to be made below the price of these Olex. And I realise that most affordable Swiss brands couldn't charge £1,500 for one of their watches. They have to be looking at the £500 or say £750 market, which is a very different area. Of course, there are some brands which also use Swiss-made to justify their commitment and philosophy. And I think a brand which perfectly summarises this and encapsulates this is L'Aventure. This relatively young brand, with a very, very innovative approach in terms of incorporating a real feel into their collection, produces 100% Swiss-made watches, and these are watches which sit in the £2,000 to £3,000 price range, with ETA movements. And they take real inspiration from Jules Verne, for example, and from early science fiction, with stunning boxes, a stunning design, and a very playful feel, which feels like something straight out of a sort of extremely tasteful European steampunk novel, which I suppose is what you could draw from these Jules Verne novels. Now, they use this 100% Swiss-made construction to justify their position. It also means they can charge a sensible price, which is in that £2,000 to £3,000 price range. And I don't think that they're charging too much. The quality is superb, the design is fantastic, and they're catching and capturing a feel, a philosophy, which makes them desirable. If someone wants to buy one, they're not worrying about the specifications. They know the quality is there. But it's a watch which makes them feel good, and I think that's enormously important. Older Chrono Swiss models also have this particular feel. Now, modern Chrono Swiss has gone in a new direction, and I must say I like what they're doing. But older Chrono Swiss is probably a good example, because the early idea of Chrono Swiss, as put forward by Gerd Rudiger Lang, the founder of this brand in the 1980s, was to create a brand capable of celebrating Swiss manufacturing and Swiss watchmaking. Now, I realise a lot of their design cues come from elsewhere, like Breguet hands, for example, but they encapsulate this Swiss feel, and so their watches really do have a Swiss-made element going through them. And so I think this celebration of Swiss-made, rather than simply using it as a word to justify quality, is the way forward. Where sub-£1,000 pieces are concerned, I think that having Swiss-made on the dial shouldn't be a necessity. I think that the watch community is savvy enough nowadays to recognise, when explained how a watch is made, to recognise the value. Of course, if a watch is being manufactured around the world, I think a brand should be open about it, because there's no shame in that. If they're able to produce a very, very good quality product from parts from all around the world, rather than making them in one place, then frankly I think I wish them all the best of luck, frankly, for that. I'm sure that there are advantages to this, certainly in terms of pricing, and the ultimate quality does say a lot. After all, most components at this price are made at least partially by machine. And so one does have to ask, does one want necessarily that entirely Swiss-made product, which to be honest isn't really possible at this price range, or is one going to be happy with something which is of higher quality, or of sensible quality, because of sourcing those parts around the world? Something which some watches have on the dial from Switzerland is handmade. Now, in fact, the sponsor of this video, Oroj, chooses to have handmade on the dial, with Swiss on the back, and I've seen these watches being made. They are made in Switzerland, and it's Swiss innovation which has gone into them too, which is also important. But they choose to put handmade on the dial because they view it as more important. And I think this is a good idea in terms of separating the Swiss side from quality and describing something as being of quality. But again, handmade's a difficult point, because I don't think that all brands could adopt this, because it is somewhat nebulous, in the sense that Patek Philippe, for example, is, for the most part, handmade. But it's not comparable to a handmade watch at the price of £2,000. They're totally different products, and handmade means something very different for each of them. So that's a difficult point. I wonder if perhaps in the future a concept of Swiss designed or Swiss engineered would make more sense. Because if you had a watch which was, let's say, £3,000, which was engineered in Switzerland, and where all the money had been spent on creating the best design, the best movement, the best innovation, and then the manufacturing had been outsourced elsewhere, perhaps you could get a better product for the price. Of course, in practice I'm sure there would be differences, but it's certainly an interesting concept, and I think shows that there can be other ways of capitalising upon the Swiss tradition of watchmaking, rather than using this Swiss-made concept, which I think at this point seems somewhat dated. But I'll be fascinated to hear what you have to say about this concept, and this always comes up for discussion every 2 or 3 years, and there's a different answer each time. So I look forward to hearing your answers and your thoughts in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this podcast and video, then remember to like, share and subscribe, because it really does help the channel and helps us to produce more videos in future. So thank you very much for listening and watching. This is Armon from watchchronicler.com, out.